Joe Carlson was the proud owner of Carlson's Repair Shop, a small but thriving auto repair business in Maplewood. Known for his ability to fix almost anything with wheels, Joe had built a loyal clientele over the years. But as his business grew, he faced challenges he couldn't solve with just a wrench and elbow grease. One day, while staring at a stack of invoices and employee schedules, Joe realized he was dealing with something far more complicated than a broken carburetor. His business was a system, and it was starting to falter. It wasn't long before Joe met his unlikely mentor, Professor Helen Reed, a retired systems analyst who brought her old Mustang in for repairs. Over coffee in Joe's cluttered office, Helen explained that just like a car, a business is a system, a set of interconnected parts working together to achieve a purpose. Joe was intrigued and asked Helen to help him understand why his once smooth-running shop was starting to stall. Helen began with an analogy. "Think of your shop like the human body," she said. "You've got the parts, your employees, tools, and customers, and you've got connections like communication, schedules, and processes. The trick isn't just knowing the parts, it's understanding how they interact." Joe nodded, thinking about how a missed part order could throw off the entire week's schedule. He realized he'd been focusing on individual issues without considering how they fit together. Helen called this then in systems thinking, the relationships between the parts. She encouraged Joe to map out the components of his business. Together, they sketched a diagram showing how customers, employees, suppliers, and processes all connected. Joe was surprised to see patterns he'd never noticed before. For instance, when the shop was busy, his front desk manager, Kelly, often skipped breaks to keep up, leading to mistakes in scheduling. The problem wasn't just Kelly, it was how the system responded to stress. Helen then introduced the concept of feedback loops. "These are the invisible forces that keep systems stable or drive them into chaos," she explained. "Take your thermostat at home, it's a balancing loop. When it gets too cold, the heat kicks in, and when it's warm enough, it shuts off." Joe thought for a moment. "Like how we hire a temp when we get too busy?" "Exactly," Helen replied. "But there are also reinforcing loops. Think of a positive customer review online. That review brings in more customers, which leads to more reviews, a cycle of growth." Joe saw this firsthand when a frustrated customer left a negative review about a long wait time. That single review had started a reinforcing loop of its own, driving customers away and causing revenue to dip. Helen went on, "The beauty of systems is their ability to adapt and self-organize. Think about how neighborhoods pull together after a storm. Systems can surprise you with their resilience." Joe shared how, during a recent snowstorm, his team had self-organized to shovel driveways for customers who couldn't make it to the shop. That small act of kindness had turned into a powerful word-of-mouth campaign. But, Helen warned, adaptability requires trust and freedom. If you micromanage, you stifle the system's ability to self-organize. Let your team take the wheel sometimes. Joe reflected on this. He was known for stepping in to handle minor issues himself, but maybe it was time to trust his team more. Helen also introduced the concept of synergy, when the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. "Your mechanics might be great individually," she said, "but when they collaborate, they can solve problems even faster and better." As Joe became more adept at systems thinking, he began to notice how small changes could ripple through his business in unexpected ways. Helen called this the nonlinear nature of systems. "Sometimes a small tweak can have outsized effects," she said. Joe thought about the time he'd introduced a new scheduling app. He expected it to save time, but it initially created confusion and delays. The issue wasn't the app itself, Helen explained, but the delay in learning how to use it. Systems often take time to adjust, and patience is key. Helen encouraged Joe to think of his business as a dynamic, living thing. "Expect surprises, Joe," she said, "but don't fear them. The goal isn't to predict everything, it's to create a system that can handle anything." One day, Joe confided in Helen about a recurring problem. His team resisted new processes. "That's a classic example of policy resistance," Helen explained. "It's when the parts of a system push back against change, often because they don't see the bigger picture." Helen suggested fostering transparency. Joe started involving his team in decision-making, explaining why changes were necessary and how they benefited everyone. The results were immediate. His team became more cooperative and even suggested their own improvements. She also warned Joe about the tragedy of the commons, where shared resources are overused. For example, if every mechanic prioritized their own tasks over team needs, the entire shop could suffer. Joe addressed this by implementing clear guidelines for tool sharing and workspace use. Finally, Helen taught Joe about leverage points, the small changes that could create big results. Think of it like tuning an engine, she said. Sometimes a minor adjustment can make a huge difference. For Joe, one of those adjustments was changing his shop's core goal. Instead of focusing solely on maximizing profits, he shifted to prioritizing exceptional customer experiences. This mindset change rippled through the business, inspiring his team and attracting loyal customers. A year later, Carlson's repair shop was thriving like never before. Joe had embraced systems thinking, and it showed. He had empowered his team, improved processes, and learned to anticipate challenges. One day, as he watched his mechanics brainstorming solutions to a tricky repair, Joe thought back to Helen's words. A well-tuned system doesn't just survive, it thrives. With his newfound perspective, Joe knew his business was ready for anything the road ahead might bring. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.